The only thing I have a lot of is women, money, and expeditions. Send another one.
All I got are my balls and my expeditions.
And absolutely no fear of God.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Unbelievable, the podcast where I, the largest scrap metal dealer in Paris, Kurt Danner, tell two unbelievable stories from history, one of them true, one of them false, to my friend, starving Portuguese explorer, Luis Mejia.
Hello. Always the Portuguese, isn't it?
It is always the Portuguese.
It really, whenever you least expect the Portuguese, that's when they most arrive in any story, especially dealing with like indigenous people somehow.
That is, a really great comment for you to make considering what one of our stories is today. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here.
That's the thing. I think we give a lot of heat to the Spanish, rightfully so, if I'm being honest. But, the Portuguese have been around for most of the time. I think they invented the African slave trade. So really, how much can they get away with?
Well, I got to say, I am just absolutely bursting at the seams to tell you these stories today, Luis. I'm really excited. But before we get to all that fun, do you have a fast fact for me to calibrate our truth-lie sensing abilities here?
I do have fast fact for you, Kurt.
Haha.
And that is, Kurt, are you familiar with the turkey?
The animal, yes.
The animal, yes. I mean, we are recording these in Christmas dates, right? Late December. So we've got turkey on our minds. And famously, Benjamin Franklin once said, hey, maybe this should be the national bird because it's brave and not cowardly like the bald eagle that flies away from all its errors. Any case, the turkey, the American bird. But did you know it's not actually American, Kurt? Because, interestingly, this turkey is from India. That is because in France, you call this turkey dinde, which means of India. In Turkey itself, the country, they call it chicken of India. Plenty of other countries, they call it the Indian chicken. And not just that, Kurt, but even in some parts of Canada, they call it the Indian chicken. So, Kurt, true or false? The turkey is from India.
The classic American Thanksgiving holiday meal turkey is originally from India.
The one that goes, that one.
Ooh.
Here goes one more time for all our listeners.
Oh, that is so magical, Luis.
Thank you.
I think that you have just simply too many times made up really bizarre fast facts to lie to me just to see if I would believe it. I don't know. I'm just not buying this for some reason. Maybe I should pay more attention to it, but I just feel like I'm not believing this in any way, shape, or form. I'm going false.
I'm openly thinking you're a liar. That's what you said.
I'm ready to make some accusations. Okay.
Well, Kurt, you are correct. That is true. It was a lie because turkeys indeed are from the Americas. Not just that, they are from Mesoamerica, meaning that they were initially domesticated by the Mexica people, by what you would call the Aztecs. They named it Huexolotl, which means essentially old monster. Incredible name.
Nice.
It means old monster, and
way better than Indian chicken.
Yeah, basically. But Huexolotl means has translated to guajolote, which is what we in Mexico call the turkey. However, there is a speck of truth in Indian turkey, because in France they do call it dinde, which means from India. In other places of the world, this word is chicken from India. Funny enough. Interestingly, in places like Malaysia, it's called the Dutch chicken because Malaysia was conquered by the Dutch and they brought with them turkey. So it's called the Dutch chicken. However, the Indian chicken myth is funny because it doesn't reference India, the country, or India, the region. It references the big foible or the big mistake that Christopher Columbus did when arriving into the Americas and thinking it was the Indies, it was India. So when they call it Indian chicken, they're not referring to India, the country, but the West Indies, aka the Americas.
Huh. That is a great comment also for you to make for our stories today. So let's just encapsulate these two details that you've presented to us that are going to become important later. One is that everybody gives Spain all the credit for exploring and, maybe messing with the natives in some bad ways. But Portugal definitely in there too. And secondly, Columbus did not realize that he had discovered a new continent. Like, he fully thought that he had landed in Asia.
The idiot. The absolute fool.
But unfortunately, once again, we are getting ahead of ourselves. Okay, so lock that away in your mind somewhere, and then let's go on this journey. Okay, and let me start out like this, Luis. I have a question for you. Do you know how long the Eiffel Tower was meant to stand after it was built?
Forever. For all time. For time immemorial, to survive through the annals of history in such way that Ozymandias would be envious.
In perpetuity.
Yeah, that's right. It will never fall. It's the only structure to remain up always.
Well, that's actually way off. So the Eiffel Tower was built in 1889 for the Paris World's Fair, and originally it was planned to be dismantled after only 20 years.
Oh.
Now, obviously, that did not end up happening because the tower became such an iconic symbol for Paris. But by the mid-1920s, the French government was starting to feel the strain of that decision. So every 7 years, the tower would have to be repainted. Because the tower was made of iron rather than steel, it needed regular maintenance. And then every so often, they'd also have to do like a large-scale renovation. So basically, this is a lot of work to maintain. Now, in 1925, 5 owners of the largest scrap metal businesses in Paris received invitations from the French government for a confidential meeting at the Hôtel de Crillon in Paris. When they arrived, they were met by Deputy Director of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs, who was a man named Victor Lustig. And in Lustig's suite at the hotel, he told the businessmen that the upkeep and costs of maintaining the Eiffel Tower had become too much of a burden for the French government. Additionally, the Eiffel Tower kind of stood out from the other landmarks of Paris, such as the Arc de Triomphe or the Notre Dame Cathedral.
Boring.
You know, these are works out of stone and ancient cultural works, whereas the Eiffel Tower is like this modern metal construction. So for these reasons, the French government had decided to sell the tower for scrap metal to the highest bidder. Now, because this deal would undoubtedly be controversial, the meeting and the transaction would have to be kept secret. So several of the businessmen were interested in this, and they submitted bids. And during a conversation with one of the businessmen named André Poisson, Director Deputy Lustig mentioned that his government salary didn't pay him very much. Certainly not enough worthy for making such a big decision as this to who to sell the Eiffel Tower to. So, like any savvy businessman, André Poisson instantly recognized the opportunity and offered Lustig a gift of 70,000 francs if he could just make sure that Poisson's bid for the Eiffel Tower won. Now, 70,000 francs would be about $60,000 today.
Okay.
Lustig accepted this bribe, and so the Eiffel Tower was sold for scrap metal. Except, there's one big problem with all of this, Luis. Victor Lustig wasn't the Deputy Director of Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. In fact, the French government wasn't even planning on selling the Eiffel Tower at all. Instead, Victor Lustig was a man about whom very little was known, who spoke 5 languages, possessed dozens of false passports, traveled with numerous disguises, and used at least 47 different aliases.
Oh, yeah.
A man who tricked businessmen and gangsters with ease, and who the American Secret Service called, quote, as elusive as a puff of cigarette smoke, and as charming as a young girl's dream.
Yeah. Ooh.
So, Luis, this is the story of the man who may be the greatest con man of all time, an international criminal best known as the Count.
Dude, and we've had so many good con men throughout the years doing this show. I mean, we've had spies, we've had double agents, we've had fraudsters before. But ooh, I like this. You better do good things to surprise me after I've heard that he's as elusive as a puff of smoke and as charming as a girl's dream.
I know.
I think you said that, Kurt, and I hate to say this, but I have once more imagined myself as this man.
I'm afraid that theme is probably only going to continue, Luis. I think you're really going to like this guy.
Yes.
And you are correct that we have a pretty rich history of scammers and con men on this podcast. You know, in preparation for this episode, I went back and listened to the Poirier ordeal, where this guy was selling people, I guess, land rights to a place that didn't exist, or having people go to a place in the New World that was just completely fictitious. Nonetheless, I still think this guy might be the greatest. So let's get into it, okay?
Let's do it.
Victor Lustig's backstory is a bit of multiple choice. According to Victor, he was born January 4th, 1890, in a village called Hostine. At the time, this was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Today, it's the Czech Republic. The most common story Victor told was that he came from a long line of aristocrats who owned many castles across Europe, and his father had been the mayor of Hostine. But in another version, Victor said his parents were poor peasants who had raised him in a small stone house. Even the time and place is in question here, because in 2015, a historian from the town of Hostine searched through records for any mention of Victor Lustig, and to be fair, a lot of these records were destroyed by the Nazis during World War II, but even after looking through the registries of students in all the schools in Hostine, he couldn't find any evidence that Victor ever existed at all.
Oh, good sign.
Now, one version of Victor's early life says that he was clever and excelled in school. Another version says he spent his time on the streets pickpocketing and pulling card tricks, but either way, Victor somehow ended up in Paris in 1909 at the age of 19 on a gambling spree. And this is either the moment that he chose to leave school and turn to a life of crime, or just another year of the same rough living, depending on which backstory you're believing here.
I really like that idea. It's like, you know what? I am tired with my studies. I must turn into a life of crime. Just that calculus class, too much for me. Crime it is.
Well, especially because if you're believing that version, it kind of is talking about how, like, he was too smart for school. That, like, school was so easy that it didn't really occupy him. And he's like, you know what? I could make way more from a life of crime. Let me go gamble in Paris.
But that's the thing, though. If school's not occupying you, that must mean that crime is harder.
Yeah, or at least paying off more.
I guess you're right. It was the becoming an influencer option of the early 1900s. What's a better influencer than a criminal? That's what I always say.
So, during his time in Paris, Victor received a scar along his left cheekbone from a jealous romantic rival in a Parisian love triangle gone wrong. And this scar would be one of the few, if not the only, identifying features that law enforcement knew about Victor for many years. So this is just kind of something that becomes like his trademark feature, this scar on his left cheek from a jealous love rival.
Yes. All the greatest have these. You know, you're a great con man until your greatest downfall is the love of a woman. Or love of any person. We're not going to limit it to a woman, you know?
Well, this is like before his criminal career really starts, but also put a pin in that the love interest being the downfall. So basically, this scar was like the only detail that law enforcement knew about Victor for a lot of his criminal career, but here's a little bit more detailed description of Victor just so we can get a clear picture. Victor was a very small man, standing only 5 feet and 7 inches tall and weighing only about 140 pounds, or 64 kilos. He had dark hair and a thin mustache, and he always dressed in fine clothes and presented himself as an old money gentleman. And the way that Victor presented himself was instrumental to nearly every scam he pulled. Everybody kind of just thought that he was like too honest, too wealthy, too dignified to be committing such a bold crime. And along with this, Victor became known as the Count to most of his victims.
Ooh.
And he was so convincing that amongst the victims who realized that they had been scammed, because by the way, some of them did not even realize, but amongst the ones who did realize, most of them still believed after the fact that Victor must be some sort of nobility, because he was just that convincing.
God, I love this man.
So, Lustig's first big con that we know of involved riding luxury ocean liners back and forth between France and New York and scamming rich people along the way. One of his most successful schemes involved convincing people to invest in a Broadway production that did not exist. And he did this until 1914, when transatlantic travel was suspended because of World War I.
Mm-hmm.
So, in search of new schemes, Victor traveled to America. Not only was Victor an expert in tricking people, but the Americas were kind of more accustomed to like the slick, fast-talking type of con man. They really were not ready for a refined Count from the old world. So, like an invasive species with no natural predators, Victor had an absolutely bang-up time convincing people to trust him with their money.
Bro, they let in the big fish into the small pond with tiny fishes. This man is probably having the time of his life.
The wolf is in the hen house, and you can definitely trust him with $50,000.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and they opened the door for him, true. Oh, God, and he's doing a Broadway musical that no one has any idea about. Incredible.
So, obviously, he pulled a lot of schemes that we don't know about, but also Victor was so prolific that we really don't even have time to talk about all the schemes that are known. So this is going to be more like a greatest hits of Victor here, okay?
Sick. Hell yeah.
Now, first off, in 1922, Victor walked into a bank in Springfield, Missouri, and expressed his interest in buying an old farm that had been repossessed by the bank. He told the bank that his family was Austrian nobility who had lost everything when his country was destroyed in the war, and he just wanted to rebuild a new life. He offered them $22,000 in Liberty bonds. So Liberty bonds were sold by the American government during the war. Basically, you could loan the government some money, and then they would give you a piece of paper saying in a certain number of years, they'll pay you back plus interest. So Victor gives the bank an envelope with $22,000 in Liberty bonds, and this is for the purchase of the farm, but also for $10,000 cash to help with farm expenses. The bank was more than happy to get rid of the farm, so they accept this offer and give Victor an envelope with $10,000. However, somehow they did not notice that Victor uses sleight of hand to take both the envelope with the Liberty bonds and the one with $10,000 with him when he leaves. And it's not clear here if he just like swapped in an empty envelope when they weren't looking or just like got both of them, but the bank effectively just gave him $10,000 for pretending to be interested in buying a farm.
Oh my God. Yes. He was a magician too. Best guy. Best guy ever.
I mean, he is a smooth criminal. But this wasn't the end of it, by the way, Luis, because the bank wanted their money back. So they hired a private detective who tracked the Count to a hotel room in New York and captured him. But then on the train ride home, Lustig convinced his captors that if news of the scam got out, there would be a run on the bank because no one would trust him with their money anymore. And on the other hand, if they would just release him, Count Lustig could forget about this whole incident for $1,000. And amazingly, this worked. They gave him $1,000 and released him.
I love that. Dude, I know the story will continue, but you have to do nothing more to convince me that this is the best boy around.
I mean, this guy, he's seeing the matrix of scamming. What is going? You catch him, and that results in him getting more money.
Seriously, man. God, I really, I'm out of I'm out of words. Honestly, I'm just here trying to think. Of course, like we all do when we're watching movies. You know, how am I gonna get out of this situation? But this man just does exactly what I think we'd all think we'd do, and somehow does it right. You know, that's just how good he is.
And, you know, I think you'll see this as the story goes on, but like the variety of the schemes he pulled is really, really impressive because, you know, to be on an ocean liner and I'm like pitching a Broadway production that doesn't exist that I'm going to solicit investing for, that's a pretty big ordeal. Then to just literally walk into a bank and be like, I snuck this envelope into my pocket when you weren't looking. That's such a small thing, but like he does both of them with the same amount of finesse. So it's really amazing the kind of ideas this guy would come up with.
I think every young boy of my ilk, and by that is nerds and people that were bullied in middle school, I think we all dream of being really good magicians and never actually succeed in doing so. And seeing someone not just succeed, but make big money and big gains. There's something about my little bullied middle school self. Yeah.
You got to respect it.
It does things to me.
So it seems like the old bank switcheroo scheme was kind of a one-off deal because as far as we know, he didn't pull this one again. But Victor also had scams that he would repeat over and over. And his most famous one was a scheme called the Romanian box. Now, he may have been doing this scheme all the way back when he was on the ocean liners, but he did this for pretty much his entire career. It was extremely successful. So, after carefully choosing a mark, Victor would direct the conversation to the source of his vast wealth, which was a box he claimed to have built called the Romanian box. Now, this box was a wooden box measuring about 12 inches on every side. On either end, it had a small slot, and then on one side were a series of brass levers and dials. And this box, Victor claimed, could perfectly copy any paper money in just 6 hours. So, to prove this, he would insert a $100 bill into one side, pull some levers and turn some dials, and then after 6 hours, Victor and the mark would return to the box and see it eject two identical $100 bills. Now, in reality, this box was useless, but Victor would put a real $100 bill inside ahead of time, with the serial numbers carefully altered to match the quote-unquote random one that he was going to copy. But when Victor showed someone the Romanian box, he would seem to walk the line between trying to sell it to them and just seeming like he was bragging about his source of wealth. And the more interested the mark would become in buying the box, the more Victor would seem to reconsider if he really wanted to sell it at all. After all, how could you really put a price on a box that literally prints money? So ultimately, Victor would be convinced to sell the box for an unbelievable amount of money. Now, the highest number that I could find was $46,000. This would be equivalent to about $840,000 today for a wooden box.
Come on. Yes. Box me up, Daddy.
Now, not only does this scheme pay unfathomably well, but it also gives you some extra time to escape because presumably you've got at least 6 hours before the person realizes they've been scammed. And sometimes Victor would even load the box with a few additional $100 bills, so it would seem like it was working at first. As far as we know, only one Romanian box victim ever managed to track Victor down, and this took place in Oklahoma. So Victor had been arrested on charges of fraud for an entirely unrelated scheme. Now, Victor showed the Romanian box to the sheriff that arrested him and ultimately convinced the sheriff to trade him the box for $10,000 and releasing Victor, which the sheriff just later claimed that Victor had escaped. Now, obviously at some point, the box stopped printing money. So 8 months later, the sheriff tracked Victor down in Chicago and held him at gunpoint. However, Victor calmly explained to him that the box worked fine. He just wasn't using it right. I mean, this guy is like a real catch me if you can moment here. That he's like, whoa, you're just not doing the proper levers and dials. Hang on.
He's doing the perfect strategy for grifters, right? You know, whenever someone comes after you about something that's not working, you just directly turn to them and say, "It's your fault. Haha, sorry." You know, it's lovely. It's lovely. I'm having a great time.
So he tells the sheriff, you know, you're just using the box wrong. But he also returned the sheriff's $10,000, and so this was good enough for the sheriff. He went back to Oklahoma. However, Luis, we can assume that this $10,000 was counterfeit, or at least partially counterfeit, because this same sheriff was later arrested in New Orleans for trying to pay with counterfeit bills at a bar on Bourbon Street and was sentenced to federal prison for it.
Come on, dude. Okay, so not only does he scam, but he makes sure that cops get arrested. He is a people princess, really. He really is.
Well, he also, you know, he's thinking on his feet here because he's like, if I give this guy his money back, he'll probably leave happily. And I just happen to have evidently $10,000 in counterfeit money sitting around.
Perfect.
So it's pretty genius because if you think about it, he still walked away with his money and his freedom. He just had to, you know, do a little bit more acting on his bid.
It's okay. Into it. Listen, we cannot forgive him. We cannot not forgive him, right? And we can't forget him either. I love him. You know, this year we had Brad Summer. We all loved Brad Summer, and this guy's really embracing male manipulator winter. You know? And I think there's a good amount of respect for him, or at least I have a good amount of respect for him for this. Not that I condone male manipulators, but if you're going to manipulate people, do it this way.
It's really just hard to hate him when you see how much of a masterful artist Victor is. I mean, truthfully, like even the people in this story who are kind of chasing after him, there's moments where you see that they have like a certain amount of respect for him because they recognize he's not just like a regular con man. This guy is like really a slippery lad.
Mm-hmm. We said it before, right? Do you think he walked around or moved about in a loose, easy manner?
Yeah, you know, I'm tempted to say yes, but also like he's a very refined gentleman. You know, you gotta keep that in mind. He's got the old money flair, so he's like a loose, easy manner by European standards, but very, very reserved by American standards, and that's why they weren't ready for him. They were like, this guy is so unloosened and so uneasy, he would never steal from me. Little did they know.
They see the presence of a European and Americans glitch out.
So in 1925, Victor returned to Paris, and he happened to read an article about the strain that the cost of maintenance and upkeep of the Eiffel Tower was putting on the French government, and this gave him a really brilliant idea. So he had counterfeit government stationery bearing his name with the fake title of Deputy Director of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs made, and then he used this paper to send letters to the owners of the 5 largest scrap metal businesses in Paris. And as we know, he told them in a private meeting that the Eiffel Tower would be sold to the highest bidder. He also took them on a tour of the Eiffel Tower, but all of this was just to allow him time to identify who was the most interested. 4 days later, after the businessmen had all submitted their bids, Victor chose not the highest bid, but the bidder who seemed the most interested, which was a man named Andre Poisson, and solicited a bribe from him of 70,000 francs. Then Victor and the counterfeiter fled to Austria, where they lived lavishly on Andre's money, and every day Victor checked the newspapers, waiting for news of the con to break, but it never did. Seemingly, Andre was too embarrassed, and truthfully, he really stood nothing to gain from going and telling on himself that he got robbed trying to bribe a government official. So, the news of this never comes out. And naturally, Luis, Victor does what any good criminal who's gotten away with a crime with no consequences would do. And that is, of course...
More crime.
More crime. Pull the same scam again. So he goes back to Paris and sells the Eiffel Tower a second time. But this time it seems that someone went to the police because Victor was ultimately forced to flee back to America to avoid getting caught.
It really goes to show, too, just how there was really nothing else to do in France in this time period. You know, how many willing salesmen of the Eiffel Tower were there? Too many, honestly. and it just goes to show just either there were a lot of people willing to sell the Eiffel Tower or there just wasn't really anything else worth doing in France at this point. That they had to deal with a fraudster like this.
I think he's really good at knowing what people are willing to easily believe. Like, I think that he calculated that the lie that this deal has to be secret because it would be embarrassing if it came out that the French government is doing this was easily believable. And then the fact that he's the government official and he's going to try to solicit a bribe for these businessmen, that was very believable. I feel like he's got this sort of misdirection where even if people were suspicious of him in some way, they'd be totally looking in the wrong place. They'd be thinking, oh, maybe he's going to buy this farm and then commit some kind of fraud or something in the process. They don't realize he's just doing sleight of hand to steal $10,000 out of their pocket right there while they're thinking,
If anything, if this were to happen to me, Kurt, I would probably even say thank you. Right? I was like, thanks for doing this. I mean, you do have to respect the man at some point.
He opens your eyes to what is possible, all right? He never knew these kind of schemes are possible. We're selling the Eiffel Tower not once, but twice.
Yeah. He shows you that there's still magic in this world. He shows you that once you free yourself from the shackles and the lens of day-to-day life, something as simple as going to the grocery store can be a fantastic experience, right? So one day, you're just, as any other day, you're selling the Eiffel Tower, and then you realize it's a fraud, and then you realize, hold on, this is more exciting than I initially gave mine to. I don't know if this made sense, Kurt, but it just made me very happy. Like, it's making me believe in the world once more.
Reject modernity. Sell the Eiffel Tower.
Sell the Eiffel Tower. Yeah.
As you may or may not have noticed here, Luis, based on the years, we're coming up to the Great Depression era. So the Great Depression started in 1929, and kind of hilariously for Victor, this was pretty bad for business because most people in banks don't really have any extra money that he can steal from them.
That's right. He took all of it.
He took all of it, and then the stock market took the rest. So there's none left to go around.
Yeah.
Now, any solutions for this? Any ideas, Luis? Who has money that Victor can steal from?
Definitely not the U.S. government, right? We know this. But probably
not.
Big businessmen, big American businessmen, this is around the time when oil was big. So oil, railroads, things of the sort. So I don't know, John D. Rockefeller or Carnegie. What do you think?
It's a good guess. But I think your head is in the wrong place. Because, one business that historically still thrives in times of economic uncertainty, organized crime.
Yes.
So the Count somehow managed to get an audience with famed Chicago gangster Al Capone.
Nice, yeah.
And he asks Al Capone for $50,000 for a scheme and assures him that he can double it in only a couple months. So Al Capone gives the Count $50,000. What do you think happens now, Luis? Any guesses?
He gets whacked.
Where's this scheme going? Gets whacked. No. The Count never dies. He's too slippery.
If he's too slippery, he does what he does best: slip out of it. I guess he's telling Al Capone he'll double that money, and just runs off with it.
No. You forget, Luis. It's always misdirection. So Victor takes the $50,000 and he puts it in a safety deposit box in his room for 2 months. And then after 2 months, he returned to Al Capone and told him the scam had failed and he'd lost everything, but he'd at least managed to recoup the $50,000 to repay Al Capone. And Al found this to be very trustworthy. So after this, when Victor confessed to him that because of the terrible economy, he had no way of supporting himself anymore, Al Capone had no problem giving Victor $5,000. And Victor took this $5,000 and never returned. And by the way, since this money was more of a gift rather than a loan, Al Capone wasn't expecting to be paid back. Yeah. So as far as we know, he never knew that this man had just fully taken advantage of him.
Okay, wait, let me go through this scam again. So he told Al Capone he would take this money and double it, right? He locked it away in a safe deposit box, the money that was given to him. And then he told Al Capone he lost it all, but I have the money you repaid, right? So he gave him back that $50,000, right?
He says like the scam that I told you I was going to do, it failed, but I still managed to scrape together the money to pay you back.
That's right. And so he gave him back that money that he was initially given.
The original money he borrowed.
And that's how he gained Al Capone's trust in order to get free money.
Yes. All of this was just to gain Al Capone's trust so he could go like, oh man, the economy sucks. Can I have $5,000? And Al Capone would be like, yeah, sure.
That is big brain.
His brain is massive,
that is
dude.
Galaxy
His brain is massive.
Yeah, this man is finding the free money glitch in real life.
He really is. I mean, he just hacked the system at every level, frankly.
Respect.
But I will say, unfortunately for the Count, around this time, his streak of luck and clever thinking did start to falter a bit. His first mistake happened the previous year when he'd been invited to a businessman's house to discuss what was probably just a made-up investment anyway. During this meeting, he snuck upstairs and stole $16,000 that he found in a drawer. And this was a pretty careless move and put a lot of heat on Victor. And then shortly after this was when he scammed the sheriff with the Romanian box and then gave the sheriff $10,000 in counterfeit money. And the combination of these two things drew the attention of the federal government, specifically the Secret Service. So, most people don't know this, but the American Secret Service was originally part of the Department of Treasury. In fact, this only changed in 2003 when they were moved to the newly created Department of Homeland Security. The Secret Service's original purpose was to stop counterfeiting, and they basically became the federal police for any money-related crime until later they transitioned to protection detail. And by the way, for anyone who isn't American and doesn't know what the Secret Service is, now they're basically like the bodyguards for presidents and other government officials, but they're all the best of the best from other law enforcement and military backgrounds, so they're like some pretty serious people. So between stealing $16,000 in broad daylight and scamming a sheriff, Victor has now gotten the attention of the Secret Service. But unfortunately for the Secret Service, not only would they have a tough time catching Victor, they knew almost nothing about him. This is around the time where his unique scar earned him the nickname the Scarred across many law enforcement agencies looking for him.
You know, I think okay, wait, hold on. Just a quick pause here, Kurt. I don't know how familiar you are with Mexican crime, but one big thing that is done whenever they arrest someone that was in a criminal organization or an organized crime is that all of them happen to have nicknames, and they all just call them the something, right? So the wild one, the red one, or stuff like that. And I think the US has stopped doing this in a terrible way, right? Because of course we have Al Capone as Scarface, we know this, and now we get Victor as the scarred one. I think the US lost the sauce, if you ask me, in terms of naming criminals fun nicknames. Sure, you do get to maybe make them martyrs or make them more exciting than you really want them to be. But hey, Mexico's still doing it. I don't know. I think that's a point for Mexico.
You know, I think they made a calculation on like reducing public panic, but also reducing like public motivation. Because, you know, you hear like, oh, there's some guy and he's scamming banks out of money here and there with Liberty bonds. You know, boring, money related, you know, that I don't care about that. But they say, oh, the Count, he's out there. He's an old world gentleman bearing a scar known as the Scarred, and he's swindling people out of money right and left. I'm like, we got to stop this guy. Which candidate in this election is running on stopping the Count? That's what I'm voting for.
Yes. Come on, Kurt. I think we need to get better at this whole naming criminal thing.
We need to return. Once again, reject modernity. Sell the Eiffel Tower.
They need to hire us into public policy. Frankly, Kurt, I think they're missing out.
They need to hire us in the Ministry of Post and Telegraphs,
yes.
Frankly. We've got some big business ideas. And speaking of big business ideas, in 1930, Lustig partnered with two counterfeiters from Nebraska named Tom Shaw and William Watts. So Shaw and Watts built plates that would be used to print counterfeit bills, and then Lustig would distribute them in return for real cash. Now, not only were these counterfeit bills masterfully done, but they were very bold about how they did it too. They would often counterfeit $100 bills, which by far received the most scrutiny from bank tellers. So basically, they're confident enough in their false money and Lustig's charm that they're willing to let people directly scrutinize the bills because they know that it'll still work. And they ultimately printed so much counterfeit currency that it threatened to destabilize the American economy and cause foreign governments to be hesitant about being paid by American bills. As one judge later put it, it's, quote, like some other government issuing money in rivalry with the United States Treasury.
Oh, wow.
So this is a pretty massive effect.
Yeah. Wow. Awesome.
Even for the Count, you know, this is new heights. Let's pause here for a moment to talk about the Count's love life. In 1919, he married a girl from Kansas and started a family with her. We don't really know much more about this, or even if they were still in contact by the 1930s. He really seemed to be much more involved with a woman named Billie Mae Scheibel. We're pretty sure that her name was Billie Mae Scheibel. We really don't know for sure because she also used many fake names. So, as you can see, she's a good match for the Count.
Of course.
And Billie Mae had her own criminal enterprise. She was the queen of a prostitution empire that stretched from New York to Pittsburgh. Interestingly, she would ultimately be brought down on charges of tax evasion, and after her arrest, her little black book that she possessed that allegedly contained the names of powerful people who had solicited prostitutes became a topic of much interest and debate. But that's a whole other story. So, basically, the Count had a pretty good deal between his Kansas trad wife and his criminal empire work wife, but unfortunately, seems like this wasn't enough, because the Count either made a pass at or started having an affair with the mistress of his business partner Tom Shaw, and Billie Mae found out about this, and in anger placed an anonymous call to police giving them information about Victor. Boo!
Narc, come on.
And this led to Victor being arrested by the Secret Service in New York in May 1935. Interestingly, it seems like this arrest was somewhat of a desperate plan because it doesn't really seem like the Secret Service had any evidence connecting Victor to the counterfeiting. In fact, they were more interested really in getting to his business partners. Since Victor had a briefcase at the time of his arrest, they were hoping that it contained counterfeit bills, but it did not. Instead, Victor had a key that ultimately opened a locker in Times Square subway station that contained printing plates for counterfeit bills and $51,000 in counterfeit currency. So they did get him on that.
Ugh, come on, amateur hour. We thought you were good, man.
He slipped up. He really slipped up. Although I do like storing your criminal enterprise materials in a locker in Times Square subway station.
Yeah.
Now, while in jail awaiting his trial, Victor bragged that no prison could hold him, and as usual, it seems his instincts were correct because Victor did in fact manage to escape. Basically, he figured out the staff wouldn't notice if bed sheets gradually went missing, and then once he had enough, he tied them together into a rope and faked an illness so he would be left alone. Then he climbed out onto a ledge, and while he tied the sheets to the building, he pretended to be using them to wash the windows so no one on the street would notice. Once the sheets were tied, he quickly climbed down, took a bow, and then ran off.
He took a bow. He had the chance
Isn't
to take
that
a bow.
just magnificent?
No, it's good.
He took a bow.
He took a bow.
That's not my detail. That's true. He's the guy who would escape from prison and take a bow before fleeing.
Like taking a bow usually means like you're thanking your audience for having been there for you, right? Your reverence thing. So awesome. I'm sorry.
There was an audience of people on the street because I think that's why he was like pretending to wash the windows in the beginning because there were like a lot of people out. And then when he descended, he did it so quickly that some people actually thought he'd fallen from the balcony. So there were like tons and tons of people that this got the attention of. So he actually was like seeing there's a crowd watching me escape prison. Let me take a bow and I'm off.
Fantastic. God, dude, I love this man. I want this.
Don't we all? Like I said, you got to respect him.
Yeah. Like I really don't care if he stole from me. I'd let him.
Love him, hate him. You got to respect. He's just doing it for showbiz.
Like,
okay.
Yeah. He's doing it for the love of the game. Like I would have this happen to me, and then I would clap and expect you now. You know.
So he escapes from prison, but 27 days later, the police found Victor in Pittsburgh. At his trial, he pled guilty and was sentenced to 20 years in Alcatraz prison. And also at his trial, journalists overheard a Secret Service agent tell Victor, quote, "Count, you're the smoothest con man that ever lived." So that's nice. And one good piece of evidence for this is that at the time he was booked into Alcatraz, it was under the name Robert V. Miller. So even at the time that he was literally sentenced and imprisoned, they still were not sure what his true identity was. Now, during the 10 years he spent in Alcatraz, Victor filed over 1,000 medical requests and received over 500 prescriptions. Prison staff thought that he was likely faking or playing up his ailments in hopes of better treatment or finding an opportunity to escape. But in 1947, Victor was transferred to a secure medical facility in Springfield, Missouri. By the way, this is the same place where he did the bank sleight of hand maneuver. And, you know, Luis, you and I are both familiar with Springfield, Missouri. It's not a very big town. So, probably they remember this guy.
Yeah, and, it's not a big town right now. So just imagine back then. Right? It's like 5 people in Springfield,
There's
Missouri.
like 30 people in Springfield, Missouri,
basically.
just super pissed about this bank robbery. So anyway, he gets transferred to a secure medical facility there. In March of that year, Victor was diagnosed with pneumonia, and 2 days later, he passed away at the age of 57.
Damn.
And unfortunately, that's it for the Count. I mean, he honestly did have a pretty long life for someone as prolific as him, but still, I want to say it's too soon.
Hey, do we want to take a moment of silence for the Count?
Let's take a moment of silence, but also we edit out any dead space in this podcast so you guys won't hear it. So we'll just roll right on.
All right, so moment of silence now.
Anyway. All right, Luis. I'm just gonna warn you. I'm coming in hot at the beginning of the story.
Good.
Okay. Pop quiz, Luis. Why is Brazil the only country in the Americas that speaks Portuguese? Tell me now or tell me now.
Well, I would assume it's because of Portugal. But I do have a thought on this, Kurt. Does it have anything to do with the Treaty of Tordesillas, which means
You're such a smart boy.
When the Spanish divided the world in half, basically said, beyond this line, it's Spanish. Beyond this line, it's Portuguese. And what we don't realize is that South America is further to the east than anyone expects. like I think what, like Peru, it's like below Florida or something like that.
Yeah.
That's my guess. Kurt.
Yeah, there was this really wild moment where Spain and Portugal said, let's just draw a line down the middle of the world, and we each own one side. And as wild as that sounds, actually the full backstory of it is a little bit wilder, and luckily this is in fact the background for our story today. So let me tell you about what happened here, okay?
Great.
So first we got to start with Christopher Columbus. Now, Christopher Columbus, as everybody knows, wanted to find a trade route to Asia via the Atlantic. And so first he asked Portugal's King John II to fund him. Now, King John II thought that this was a stupid idea because the journey to Asia would be so long that even if they did find a route, Columbus and his crew would almost certainly starve to death before they arrived. Columbus actually thought the world was a lot smaller than it really is. So he was expecting Asia to be about where the Americas is. So actually, if the Americas didn't exist, Columbus would have almost certainly starved to death somewhere in the Pacific.
Sick.
But anyway, all this to say that King John is not a believer in this idea, so he passes, and instead Columbus goes to Spain for funding. So as we know, in 1492, Columbus sails, he finds some Caribbean islands, and then on his way back to Spain, Columbus stops in Portugal to brag to King John II that he was right. He tells him that he sailed southwest of the Canary Islands and encountered lands, presumably some part of Asia. And, you know, the most hilarious part about this is that Columbus is, of course, still wrong because he's saying what he found is Asian islands, but that's not the case. He found the Americas. But this is probably not even the main focus for King John because Columbus said that he found land southwest of the Canary Islands. Now, the Canary Islands are a cluster of islands off the coast of Morocco, and the reason why this is significant is because Spain and Portugal had only recently signed a treaty granting all land south of the Canary Islands to Portugal and all land north of it to Spain. So there's like this imaginary line running around the world at the latitude of the Canary Islands, dividing north and south. So King John sent a letter to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, reminding them that they signed this treaty, and so the land Columbus discovered belongs to Portugal. And he's currently working on sending an armada to claim this land, so Spain better not show up. Now, Spain replies that these islands belong to them, and Portugal better not show up.
Come on.
And this finally ends in a negotiation where they agree to change the imaginary line. So they were like, we tried dividing this bad boy left to right. What if we try top to bottom? They sign a new treaty called the Treaty of Tordesillas, as you said, with a new line running from the North Pole to the South Pole, basically through the middle of Greenland, down the Atlantic, and then through kind of the eastern bump on South America, basically about the eastern one-third of Brazil. So Spain gets the west side of this line, which includes 90% of the Americas, and Portugal gets the east side of this line, including the little nubbin of Brazil. And by the way, no other country signed off on this. Like, the Pope was involved, but nobody else cares about this agreement. No one else is going to honor this. But for Spain and Portugal, this imaginary line in the Atlantic is like the only thing preventing all-out war.
Hey, listen, it's history is all about the arbitrary agreements, right? And I'm into it. I think we need a little more arbitrary agreements. Well, never mind. I think we have enough, right? I don't know enough about the world, I guess.
You almost weighed in on global foreign policy, and then you were like, ooh, hang on a second.
No,
let's do some self-preservation here.
Yeah, no, I needed to backtrack a little bit. I don't want to get involved in modern, in contemporary world politics. Not at this point.
But I think you were exactly right when you said that history is made up of imaginary lines. I mean, that really is what it's all about. You know, that's what makes the world go round. It's the imaginary lines that we get the Pope to help us agree on.
I mean, arbitrary lines like Israel being an arbitrary country. Who cares?
You're wading in again.
Damn, sorry.
I'm not going to tell you stop, but Luis, this podcast can get stopped at any moment, okay? So one thing that was kind of interesting about this whole signing of this treaty where they made the new imaginary line is that it's kind of interesting to speculate how much of the New World the Spanish and Portuguese knew, because obviously any maps that they had at this time were very rough and would only cover small sections or islands. Some people think that Portugal may have already known about the area that's now Brazil, because pretty shortly after this treaty was signed, Portuguese explorers, quote-unquote, accidentally found Brazil on the way to explore India. And, if you think about, like, of this new continent, you only have, like, access to 10% of it. What are the odds that you accidentally bump into that small part on the way to somewhere else, But over time, Portuguese colonizers pushed this imaginary line further and further west until it got to the size Brazil is today. But all this to say that at the time, because the Portuguese could only access a small part of the Americas, they mostly focused their exploration efforts on other parts of the world. So even though they did have this accidental discovery of Brazil in 1500, they don't end up doing any significant exploration in the Americas really until 1523. Now in 1523, the Portuguese monarchy chose a man named Gaspar Madeira to lead an expedition to establish a trading colony in the New World. And Gaspar was a vice admiral in the Portuguese Navy. Portugal hadn't been in a naval conflict in 50 years, so there weren't many people in the Navy with combat experience, but Gaspar at least had been on several expeditions surveying the Azores Islands. These are some islands that Portugal owns right next to Spain's Canary Islands. And he also led an expedition around the Cape of Good Hope, which is the southern tip of Africa. He also had a lot of connections and friendships with many people in charge of the Navy and the monarchy, so maybe these reasons or some combination of these reasons was why he was chosen. But anyway, the expedition took two ships called the São Rafael and the São Luís, and Madeira would captain the São Rafael. He chose a captain named Jorge de Barros to be the captain of the São Luís.
Good name.
The São Luís, or which one are you referring to here?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's São Luís. Good. Yeah, it's pretty good.
The Saint part in the beginning got a nice ring to it, kind of.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah, that's good.
So, on March 13th, 1523, the ships departed with 59 men on board, and these were mostly sailors, but also some carpenters, stonemasons, and farmers. And about 5 months into the journey, the ships hit pretty bad weather and strong winds that continuously pushed them further and further north off their course. And unfortunately, these conditions continued for the next 2 months until October 9th, when the ships made landfall on an island in the Caribbean. Now, obviously, this is much further north than they intended to be, and even worse than this, the sails of the São Luís had been badly damaged by rough weather, so its speed was pretty greatly diminished. At this point, food and water had nearly run out, so the captains were facing a pretty tough decision, because if you try to sail back to Portugal, you'll starve on the way. If you try to sail the rest of the way to Brazil, you'll probably starve on the way, but if you don't, you're going to have to hope that there's food and water quickly and easily available, because if not, you're going to starve. And if you stay put, you'll starve. Evidently, there's not an abundance of resources on this island that they landed on. And also, no one's going to find you because no one knows where you are. So, it seems like it's kind of starvation no matter what you choose here. But, Luis, there was a fourth option.
Starve.
No, this one has no starvation, but I will say that for many of the sailors, it might have actually been an option worse than starvation. But it turns out there was a place nearby that Europeans knew about that had supplies. A place that was located somewhere on the coast of the mainland, near these islands that they had currently landed on one of. Pop quiz, Luis. What settlement was established in the Americas in 1519?
Hold on, Kurt. Don't do this to me.
Oh, I'm doing it.
I'm about to get real excited.
Oh, I'm doing it.
Oh, Kurt, are you talking about my precious hometown of Veracruz, Mexico?
Oh, yeah, baby.
Oh, we're doing it. We're going to La Villa Rica de la Veracruz, founded April 21st of 1519.
So, as Luis is currently getting excited about, in 1519, Spain established Veracruz, which is, of course, Luis's hometown.
That's right.
And this was the first city founded by Europeans in the Americas. So Spain began using it as a port to receive settlers and laborers and transport goods back to Spain. Veracruz is built on the eastern coast of Mexico, so like on the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean Sea. So even though the Portuguese had pretty limited knowledge probably of the geography here, they know that they must be near Veracruz, and presumably they can just sail west until they hit the coast of the mainland and then follow the coast north until they see the port. And, truthfully, I was only kind of half joking before when I said that this might be worse for the Portuguese than starvation, because, not only do they historically have a lot of bad blood with the Spanish, but this also could be seen as a major violation of the Treaty de Tordesillas, because they're going to have to show up and convince Spain that they didn't mean to trespass, that they're here on accident.
I will say it's also maybe worse than starvation, because as much as I love my hometown, it only became like well equipped to live here properly in like the 1920s, right? There were just a quick Veracruz fun fact for all those that want to know. There were travel books from 1800s that say, if you come to Mexico, stay in Veracruz for a total of 3 days. Any longer, you will die of yellow fever.
Wow.
Veracruz was not a safe place to be, because if it's not the yellow fever, it might be syphilis or it might just be black vomit at some point. So that's bad all around.
Yeah, this is not a move for comfort. This is just a move for survivability here. They're just like, look, they at least have more food and water than we've got right here, okay?
Yeah, I guess so.
So, because this is a pretty difficult decision to make for multiple reasons, the boats end up spending a few days sitting in place trying to decide what to do, which of course just exacerbates the situation of supplies running low, so they're running even more out of food and water, but finally, they get to the point where they decide they really have no choice, so they take whatever supplies they can off the São Luís and load it onto the São Rafael, and with 59 men now crammed onto one ship, they begin sailing for Veracruz. Such a travesty that the São Luís will not be going to Veracruz, but unfortunately, they had to abandon it because of damaged sails.
Damn. Yeah, it's always Luis having a hard time making it back to Veracruz, isn't
it? he's slow moving. You know, what are you gonna do about that?
Classic Luis.
Classic Luis. And so a few days later, they arrived, and it seems like the Spanish were equal parts confused and annoyed that the Portuguese were showing up. Eventually, Gaspar Madeira made an agreement with the Spanish, so the Spanish will give supplies for Gaspar and most of his men to sail home. Meanwhile, Captain Jorge de Barros and some of his men will stay behind, and when Gaspar gets back to Portugal, he'll establish negotiations between Portugal and Spain and negotiate payment that Spain is satisfied with before they transport Captain de Barros and the remaining men back to Europe. So they're basically going to leave Captain de Barros and some other men as like collateral, so Spain, make sure they get paid adequately. Yeah. And obviously, Portugal is not going to be very happy about having to negotiate from this position, but at least, the ordeal will be over. However, when Gaspar got back to Portugal, he was able to start the negotiations and got his sailors home, but that wasn't really the end of the story, because there was a little more that was going on here. In total, Gaspar and his crew had now been gone for a little over 3 years, on a journey that was really only supposed to take about a year in total. So when the expedition hadn't returned after a year, Gaspar's brother Paulo went to King John II to request permission to organize an expedition to go look for Gaspar and his crew. And Paulo was offering to provide most of the funding for the expedition, so it was probably pretty easy for King John to say yes. Funnily enough, they specifically warned Paulo not to wander into Spain's territory and risk starting a war, something that his brother would be doing in probably about a few months. And just something to mention here, Paulo doesn't have military background. He had some experience captaining merchant ships, but the men on board aren't soldiers, they're just hired sailors. So Paulo's expedition left October 1524, and after a year had passed, they also had not returned. So, King John is probably like, what in the world is happening to all my expeditions that I'm sending over to the New World? And this may be a little bit of an insane decision to make, but he decides to send another expedition to look for them.
Hey, baby girl. Whenever you don't know what to do, send an expedition.
Just keep sending expeditions. It'll work eventually.
Return to tradition, send an expedition, and purchase the Eiffel Tower when in doubt.
Sell the Eiffel Tower to fund your 5th expedition to the New World, King John II is like, look, you miss 100% of the expeditions you don't take, okay?
People are like, what, King John, why would you do this? King John turns around and says, listen, the only thing I have a lot of is women, money, and expeditions. Okay? Send another one.
All I got are my balls and my expeditions.
And absolutely no fear of God.
So we're on expedition number 3, rescue expedition number 2, and this time the man that King John chose to lead the expedition was Admiral Duarte de Lima. He was one of the highest ranking officers in the Portuguese Navy, and he had a reputation of being a real no-nonsense guy. However, I like to also imagine that King John either chose this guy because he's not willing to risk sending another expedition led by a civilian, or maybe he's just fed up with dealing with these two brothers and he's like, I need an expedition led by someone outside this family. We've given enough New World expeditions to the Medina family, okay? We gotta get some new blood here.
Someone else, please. There's Nepo babies in colonial expeditions.
I know, it's insane. So anyway, King John sends Duarte de Lima with 2 ships and specific instructions to just quickly check and come back. Basically, if you find any of these people alive, bring them back. If you don't find them or they're already dead, just come back right away. Bottom line is, make sure you come back because we are not sending any more ships after this. So, Duarte de Lima and his ships leave Portugal December 1525. A couple months after this, in February 1526, is when Captain Gaspar Medina and the São Rafael returned to Portugal. But, of course, at this point, Duarte de Lima was already on his way to Brazil. And when he arrived several months later, he saw what was probably the most shocking scene of his life. So, shortly after arriving in the Americas, Duarte and his crew spotted Paulo's ship anchored and empty. They went ashore and quickly encountered members of the crew living amongst an indigenous tribe called the Yuma. And Duarte learned that the voyage had been rough. More than half the crew had contracted an illness during the trip. Many of them had died, including Paulo and his first mate. And once they arrived in the Americas, they had encountered the Yuma. Now, if the Yuma had any previous contact with the Europeans, it was probably one of the few times Portuguese explorers had briefly stopped in the Americas and exchanged gifts with them. So the Yuma were, if anything, friendly to Portuguese sailors and took them into their village. Now, something that's very important about the Yuma, they did not have the same taboos and opinions that we have about sex. And without getting too graphic here, the Yuma didn't have taboos about things like age, multiple partners, familial relation, or privacy that we would have. They weren't exactly polyamorous because they had partnerships and 2 parents and stuff, but they just didn't consider sex to be one of the things confined to monogamy. And obviously this is very unique, and it kind of begs the question, why is their culture like this? You know, I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of the things that we find taboo are that way just because they're like bodily functions. Like, why is it taboo just to talk about like sex as a concept just because it's related to bodily functions? But also at the same time, pretty much everyone who ever existed more or less agreed with this opinion. Yeah. So, you know, the Yuma are the outlier here. So what happened? Now, the simplest explanation is that this was just a unique element of their culture that had been preserved because of isolation. But there's a more interesting theory relating to the Yuma people's diet. So they ate a lot of the things that you might expect, like fish and plantains, but notably they ate a lot of pineapple. And one of the main chemicals in pineapple is bromelain enzyme. Pop quiz, Luis. What happens if you consume huge quantities of bromelain enzyme? Good luck.
Do you...
The Veracruz one was so easy, you know, I had to throw you a hard one to mix it up.
Okay, I have two things that I would like to answer. One,
yes.
Whenever I eat a lot of pineapple, my tongue hurts, and
okay.
My tongue itches a lot, and I think it's something to do with how the acids react with the body. That, or maybe I'm allergic. I don't know. I'm yet to figure that one out. Also, I am going to go out on a limb here and say that consuming a lot of this changes the flavor of your bodily fluids.
Wow, that's very imaginative, Luis. And I guess I will say, to be fair, there might be other chemicals in pineapple that do one or both of these things. I don't know about them. I only know about the bromelain enzyme. And oddly enough, there actually are 2 different things that the bromelain enzyme does, but neither one of them are those. So first of all, bromelain enzyme can act as a natural contraceptive. So it's very possible that because the Yuma were consuming so many pineapples, they didn't understand that sex and pregnancy were connected. They didn't see like a correlation because there was like a lot of natural contraception happening. They may have believed something like pregnancy happened at random or whenever the gods decided. We don't really know enough about their culture and beliefs to know that, but this could have been the case. Now, secondly, high concentrations of bromelain enzymes have been linked to increased rates of something called pyloric stenosis. Pyloric stenosis is a condition in infants where the esophagus and intestines swell and block food or water from entering the stomach. And in modern times, this can usually be fixed with surgery, but in a pre-surgery world, this would almost always result in the infant dying of starvation or dehydration because it just can't get food or water. Now, one notable thing about pyloric stenosis is that For reasons we still don't understand, pyloric stenosis affects male infants almost twice as often as female infants. So it's very likely that the Yuma tribe was majority female. So basically, these sailors have had a very bad time on their way to the New World, and by the time they arrive, there's no one in charge left alive. Then they encounter the Yuma, who not only meet their food, water, and shelter needs, but also a number of other needs they had that would have almost certainly been frowned upon in polite society. And, luckily, Duarte has found them without much trouble, so now they can all go back to Portugal, except most of the men in Paulo's crew say that they aren't going. And we don't know much about these men, whether they were married or not, or if they had families, but it seems like rather than return to stuffy Catholic Portugal and face the shame of failing so bad on their expedition, they're content to stay here in their little tropical paradise. And it seems like some of the sailors from Duarte's ship are kind of being won over by this idea, or at least they think it might be worth staying for a few days before they go home. And this causes Duarte to absolutely lose his mind. So he goes to the ship and gets a whip. They would have sometimes had a whip on board in case a sailor needed to be flogged. And sometimes this whip would be made from extra rope, but other times it would be something called a cat o' nine tails. Pop quiz, Luis. What is a cat o' nine tails?
Cat o' nine tails. I'm thinking it's like...
Oh, come on, pirate enthusiast.
Okay, I have an idea, Kurt.
Never heard of no floggings?
Yeah, so, okay, so I'm thinking of a rod with like 9 different pieces of leather.
Leather?
Right? So it looks like a horsetail. Or... I'm also thinking, I just went to a museum recently talking about metallurgy in the Viceroyalty of New Spain.
Oh,
very exciting weekends I've been having lately. And something that Catholics were very keen on, or at least very intense Catholics were very keen on back in the day, back when they weren't cowards, is that they would hit themselves with a piece of metal that basically had a bunch of barbs.
Ooh.
Right? As penitence.
A little self-flagellation.
As penance
yeah,
a little self-flagellation, but with metal barbs. Said something like this, Kurt.
Man, I feel like you really raised the bar we're self-whipping with barbed wire now. Now my cat o' nine tails doesn't seem very impressive, but no, it's just a regular whip with like 9 different pieces of leather, like you said. It's not as long as what you would picture like a bull whip or like Indiana Jones whip, but it's got like 9 different pieces. So theoretically, you're getting 9 times the whip out of it. Now, just for the record, we don't know if this was the whip he had or if it was like a whip made out of rope, but I mean, ignorance is bliss in this podcast. I'm picturing the 9 tails, okay? So Duarte has his whip, possibly cat o' nine tails, and he begins flogging sailors who are refusing to leave and berating them, saying, quote, "Act like the honorable Christian Portuguese men you are." Basically, he's saying, get a grip and get on the boat. We're leaving. And this worked for all of Duarte's men and most of Paulo's crew, but not all. So some of Paulo's men just fully got left behind in Brazil, Luis.
Oh. Okay.
And then this trip back to Portugal was fairly uneventful, except for the fact that a couple of Duarte's crew died on the way of illness. After returning to Portugal, Duarte and his first mate and the men from Paulo's crew testified before the royal court, and Duarte presumably was surprised to learn that Captain Gaspar was alive and had already returned several months earlier. And of course, this whole ordeal was a huge embarrassment for pretty much everyone involved, with the possible exception of Duarte. Because, the first expedition lost a ship, which is pretty bad, but then they had to get help from Spain, which is, like, really bad. Then the second expedition ended up leaving their ship in Brazil, and also, as Duarte told the crown, quote, succumbed to the heathenist practices of savages and had stripped themselves of any honor or decency, so that's not a good look.
Oh, come on. You're just having sex, you Puritan pricks. Jeez.
And then the third expedition didn't really mess anything up, but it's kind of embarrassing because they did end up going all this way for basically nothing, because Gaspar got himself back to Portugal and Paulo's crew really didn't want to go in the first place anyway. So afterwards, the story of Paulo's crew doing some partying in Brazil became pretty sensational. And for a little while, saying someone is a member of Paulo's crew or has decided to join Paulo's crew became slang for having an affair, which I think is pretty great. Additionally, this whole experience really seemed to sour King John on New World expeditions, and it was several years before another Portuguese expedition to the Americas was even considered. So this is basically the end of our story, but just to close out here, Luis, I have a couple of just my own personal conspiracy theories about this that I want to run by you and see if this resonates with you at all. Okay, you ready?
Let's hear it.
Okay, so theory number 1. if you can't tell from this story, the first trips from Europe to the Americas were pretty brutal. Like, even in the best case scenario, you're probably going to be half starved and wondering if you're lost by the time you arrive. So maybe Paulo and his first mate didn't die of illness, but rather of a mutiny on the way to the Americas. Or maybe after they arrived, Paulo wanted to continue searching for his brother elsewhere, but the crew was not done with their little spring break in Brazil and refused and mutinied. I don't know. Just an idea. Is there anything there?
I like spring break in Brazil. I like to believe that.
Don't we all?
A big spring break destination, even in the 1500s.
But
I respect
but
it.
are you a believer in mutiny to get our spring break? Could that be possible?
I'm always a believer in mutiny.
All right. Well, that's great to know.
Never hold myself back.
So theory number 2 is that not all of Duarte's men came home. So I mentioned earlier that on the return voyage, a couple sailors in Duarte's crew died of some sort of illness. Is it possible that these men actually refused to leave the Americas and were left behind as well? Because, it would be one thing for Paulo's hired sailors to refuse to leave, but if naval sailors under Duarte's command refuse to leave, it's a whole other thing for Duarte's reputation and for the Portuguese Navy's reputation. Mm-hmm. So maybe rather than admit that there were a couple of men from his crew that refused to leave, they made up the story about how they died on the way home. I don't know. Just a thought.
I like that. That makes it creative. That, it makes...
You feeling it?
Yeah, no, I like... I think we both know, Kurt, we really don't care what we're doing as long as it makes a fun story. And I think these guys are living that life. They're in it for the anecdote, really.
So what do you think about all this, Luis? I mean, how do you categorize this story? Is there some kind of lesson to be learned here, or is this just regular shenanigans of a colonizing power, or is this some sort of like weird coincidence where how could you mess up so bad that you have 3 different expeditions being sent to the same place and they all kind of make a mess in a different way? What are your thoughts?
I think the moral of the story is never trust a Portuguese man. I think the moral of the story is that the Portuguese should have just stayed out of Latin America. Just a thought. Although I will say, as someone that is a great fan of Brazilian Twitter, I don't know, man. I think the Portuguese give me bad vibes, generally. And I think it all started from the way they've taken Spanish and made it their own in a weird way. Like, why does such a small country have such a big influence around the world? I hate it. Don't like it.
Boy, oh boy. The opinions are really coming out now. Now we're getting into the language stuff. Portuguese is fake Spanish. All right. Goodbye, Portuguese listeners.
They are not paying attention to us, Kurt. Please. Are you kidding me?
Hey. Goodbye, Portuguese listeners, and don't let the door hit you on the way out, okay? We saw what you did in the New World.
Yeah, I've opened the door for the Portuguese listeners to get out, They started the African slave trade. I can't forgive them for this, so... I'm never going to forget. So, yeah.
I think it is pretty comical that, like, you think about, they really only have like this one little chunk of the Americas, like this little tiny piece. And then, meanwhile, at this point in history, Spain's already up and going to the point where they've at least like got a port in Veracruz and some kind of establishment, and they're shipping things back to Spain. And I think like probably even a few years from this point is where they would get to where they had like a whole system where it'd be like you go from Veracruz to Cuba and then Cuba to Spain, and there's a whole fleet of ships going back and forth twice a year. Meanwhile, Portugal's like just struggling to death to handle this one little part. They can't even get there without being blown off course. And then as soon as they do get there, they're like, what if we just drop all semblance of our society and join this? And you know what? I don't know if I can fault them for that decision.
Well, I mean, they arrive in Brazil and get seduced by the allure of sex.
These pineapples got me acting strange.
Got me acting strange. I cannot blame them for this.
Pineapples got me ready to risk it all. They came seeking gold and they found pineapple.
A man can dream, right?
So like I was saying earlier, Luis, I really was excited to tell you these stories because both of them, for totally different reasons, I think are really exciting and really fun. Both of them have like some pretty stupid details, some pretty exciting details, and then we even get some cameos such as the Saint Luis and, we're going to Veracruz to ask the Spanish for help. I guess I really just want to know, like, this is so much information I feel like I've dumped on you. We went from selling the Eiffel Tower to scamming banks in Springfield. Al Capone was in here, and then the Portuguese were rattling around on a spring break trip in Brazil. What do you make of all this?
I like it. I think it was a nice mix of stories, Kurt, because...
That's a good start.
Yeah, I like fraudsters, and I like the shenanigans that went on with the colonization of the New World. Not saying, and I want this to be clear and on record, I'm not saying that I find the colonization of the New World amusing. I just find the politics that went into it funny because no one knew what they were doing.
Yeah, it's not one of those permissible things like cannibalism or eugenics.
Okay, Kurt, no need to bring this up. But, I don't agree with colonization, but it's just, I love that we tend to think of history as people that knew what they were doing and had a plan, had visualized things. But no, it's just a bunch of rich pricks, making up rules as they go and setting themselves to a stupid standard that they themselves made, and I find that amusing a lot. And I think that combined with someone trying to sell the Eiffel Tower twice, it scratches a perfect itch in my brain. It's good.
Yeah. I think there were two details that I was really blown away by from these stories. One of them was that, even in your best case scenario, like everything goes according to plan, you're still starving by the time you get to the New World if you're going on an exploration in the 16th century. Like, that's insane to be like, according to plan, we're starving and on the brink of mutiny by the time we arrive. Yeah. I mean, you gotta, like, even if you disagree with what the reasons for going were, you gotta applaud those people for doing something so insane in the name of progress, I guess. I don't know if I'm saying you have to hand it to Cortez necessarily, but
yeah, who would say that? That's stupid,
But that's just that's not really how you picture it, You picture like people, like you said, knew what they were doing at the time. And then like on the other side with the other story, I just keep thinking about the detail that by the time they got this guy sentenced and in prison, they still don't know who he is. Like, that just seems like a legal system that can't operate. And yet that's the story of the Secret Service taking down probably one of the most prolific con men of American history. Yeah. But it's just so bizarre to think about. We always say that, like, these crazy things in history are not as far back as we think they are. But that's just wild to think they could have someone fully in Alcatraz, America's most secure prison at the time, and they don't even know who he is. And then from our other story, according to plan, counts as we're starving and about to be killed by our crew.
It's the reality of the world, and I think it's what makes this podcast special. That we realize that we've all just been stupid always.
Well, with that spirit, Luis, let's move on to our least favorite part of this podcast: a little bit of
deliberation.
So, as we were just saying, I told you the story of the Count, the Scarred, Robert Miller as they booked him into Alcatraz, but really a man most likely named Victor Lustig, although it's possible that wasn't his real name. And then I told you the story of the Portuguese getting in here not once, not twice, but thrice. And they're all over the place. They're in Veracruz, they're in Brazil, having spring break, and everybody's mad about it in the end. What do you think, Luis? Where's the lies?
I really like these stories, Kurt, because it really goes to show how much, I don't know how to say it, but I think we're all trying to hold someone accountable for things always, and just the fact that some people are just getting away with stuff, it hurts us or makes us very angry, right? Because really, what bad are they doing here, right? The Brazilians or the Portuguese that arrived and just wanted to have spring break, they're having a good time, they're enjoying life. Sure, at the expense of the crown's money, whatever. You're taking away from the oligarchs. And what about Victor's story? Yeah, he's just wanting to make a little bit of money, a little bit of cash. But he's taking money straight from Al Capone and from corrupt politicians.
It's like Robin Hood.
If there's a thread that ties these stories together, is that they're socialist heroes, honestly. And I respect it.
Champions of the working class.
Champions of the working class. But the reason why we're so angry at them is, or at least why people at the time were so angry at them, is because, they're doing stuff and they're not being held accountable for any of it. And I think that's what leaves us uncomfortable. I'm not, okay, once more, I don't want to hand it to these guys. I don't want to say that their behavior is acceptable, but there's a part of it that you really gotta say, hell yeah.
You can't help but respect a man who not only sleight of handed a bank in Springfield, Missouri, but also sold the Eiffel Tower twice. And you can't help but not respect some random Portuguese sailors who are like, hey, we just discovered a liberated society and we are never going home.
Yeah, they discovered Rio de Janeiro, present day. In any case, Kurt, I think I've made my decision, all right. Honestly. So here's the thing, Kurt. I really, really like both stories, and I think you really gave the special sauce in both of these, because you have a way of knowing exactly A, what appeals to me, B, just all the shenanigans just the context of the shenanigans that have gone on in life, and 3, the fact that I love shenanigans too, and that I'm also aware of these shenanigans from across time. And let's talk about Portugal first.
Let's talk about Portugal.
Well, even though I don't want to, but we
Contractually obligated to talk about Portugal, as usual on this podcast.
You see, I think in early colonization of the Americas, a lot of the people that arrived really just found an idyllic paradise in this part of the world. You know, there are stories of people that did shipwrecks in the Yucatan Peninsula that eventually just fell in love with the culture, stayed, and, you know, started mestizo culture, which is kind of wild. And people that some of defectors of the colonizing strategy that said, wait, maybe this is the best place in the world. This is great, and we don't want to make it worse. And I feel like you typically see these stories and you don't see a lot of retribution, especially from high up, right? They would have so much money, and they would have gotten so much money that sending another expedition was just a free money printing hack, right? You send another expedition, you know you're going to get money out of it, so it doesn't matter that we lose 2 or 3 ships. As long as one gets there and we get our gold, we should be good.
Right.
So this bureaucracy, in order to try and get this expedition that was lost in these parts of the world, even though there's a lot of politics, ridiculous politics around the Treaty of Tordesillas and everything going on here, I'm finding it hard to believe that they would send 2 more expeditions to find sailors loving life, you know? So and I like the other story a lot, because although I do see myself in it, you got that right. I do think that there's more details, more verifiable details. I think it's more likely for us to fall for scams than to try and help our fellow man.
That's true. Yeah.
So I think we're more likely to give in to wanting to make more money and then lose it all than be kind to others and have empathy. And just, I think, human nature. I'm going to count on you, and I'm going to say that the first story with Victor is the true story. Final answer.
You're a believer in Victor, not a believer in the New World Spring Break.
That's right.
But, you know, I'll say this, Luis. I think that almost any story I would have put with the Victor Conman story, you still would have picked the Victor one. I feel like you might just love that story too much. But luckily for you, that is a true story. You are correct. Unfortunately for the Portuguese, no spring break in Brazil. But fortunately for Victor, lots and lots of absolutely genius scams.
It's great. Yeah. Foiled once again by the selfish nature of man.
So I definitely want to have some time where we get to enjoy talking about Victor, and truthfully, like, seriously, what a master artist this man was of parting people with their money. But real quick, I just want to say what the true parts of the false story were. Obviously, the background history on the Treaty of Tordesillas and dividing up the world was all factually true things. There is a tribe called the Yuma, but it has no connection to the one I'm describing. But the description of the Yuma people was based on the Trobriand people. The Trobriand people live on the Trobriand Islands in Papua New Guinea, and they have kind of a similar lack of things we would consider taboo to the Yuma, but it's not exactly the same. And also, some accounts of Trobriand practices come from questionable sources, so it's difficult to say what exactly is true and what's not. But obviously that didn't matter to me, since I'm just making up a false story. But the Trobriand people do have very unique traditions for marriage and relationships, and they do believe that pregnancy results from an ancestral spirit entering a woman's body. And this failure to see a correlation between sex and pregnancy might be a result of the copious amount of yams eaten by the Trobriand. So yams have a chemical called diosgenin in them, which may work as a natural contraceptive in high quantities. And by the way, just as a fun little note, other than being a staple food, yams do hold a lot of importance for the Trobriand people. In some cases, they're even used as currency or gifts. For example, so after a year of marriage, either the husband or wife can choose to unilaterally divorce their partner if they're just not into it. And if the couple gets divorced and one person wants to try to get back with the other one, it's tradition to send a whole bunch of yams and other gifts to their family to try to win them back. So I like a society that's built on yams as a currency and as a commodity.
Yeah.
But anyway,
yam action.
That being said, Victor Lustig, I mean, I just can't stress enough. I love this guy. He's got a multiple choice backstory. His girlfriend has a multiple choice backstory. Sick. He's pulling every scam. He's doing the complicated ones where he was on an ocean liner saying I got a Broadway play. He's doing the simple ones where he just sleight of handed a bank out of $10,000. I mean, and he scammed Al Capone. Well, what more could you want from this guy?
What more do you want from this guy? For him to have lived a happy life until he was 90 years old. That's probably the only thing I want for him.
And you got to remember that he is being like a old money, old world gentleman this whole time when he's doing it. You know, I think this is what allows him to be able to use the same character where he's pulling a scheme where he's selling the Eiffel Tower and pulling a scheme where he's asking for, you know, basically a bank loan sort of. The guy just must have been slippery beyond comprehension. Which there it is. We were saying because you said conducted his business in a loose, easy manner, which is, of course, a quote referring to Dusko Popov, the man who was an inspiration for James Bond. And when you told me that string of words, I said they should put that on your tombstone. Conducted his business in a loose, easy manner. But slippery beyond comprehension. That's pretty good, too. I feel like that might be a good description for Victor.
I must also admit, I am not slippery beyond comprehension. I am constantly, damp, I will admit, but not slippery. If anything, it makes me...
Would be if we could be. Unfortunately, we're going to have to settle for moist.
We're going to settle for moist, damp, constantly sticky for no apparent reason.
And just a little clammy.
Just a little clammy. Like if you throw dollar bills at me, they will stick to my skin. You don't need to tar and feather me. You can skip the tarring part. Just throw feathers and they will stick on.
So, Luis, lastly, I did hype up at the very beginning of this episode that this was a story of what may be the greatest con man of all time. And as I said, we've got a pretty in-depth history of con men on this podcast. You were the one who brought the Prince of Poitiers story to this pod. Mm-hmm. Do you think that, is this guy, Victor Lustig, maybe the greatest con man of all time, or what do you think?
He's up there.
Did I make my case?
He's up there. He's making it.
He's up there.
He's up there. He's in my top 3 of scammers.
It's a tough call because Poitiers guy, he did sell people land rights to Poitiers like 3 or 4 separate occasions. Mm. I mean, at one point, they were like, you're in trouble for doing this. You owe us a bunch of money. And he said, you know how I'm going to make that money? By selling land rights to Poitiers.
Yeah, but that's the thing. I think this guy's this guy takes the cake because not just did he make that money, but he tried to do it again. Because Prince of Poitiers guy did it once and then wasn't able to do it again. This guy had the grind, had the grind mindset. Entrepreneur, if you ask me.
Poitiers guy couldn't diversify. Victor, he's like, World War I starts, no problem, I'm still scamming. Great Depression starts, no problem, I'm still scamming. The French government is burdened by the strain of the Eiffel Tower, no problem, I'm scamming twice.
Don't let the frailty of our society stop you from scamming. Okay.
Sell the Eiffel Tower. There's no downside.
There's no downsides. You'll only be happier afterwards.
Unfortunately, there are some downsides to this episode, at least for me, because that's a point for you, which makes our score 9 for you and 6 for me. So, we might have to go to DEFCON 5, 1 point away for you. It's getting dangerous. And I'll say, I really brought my A game this time, but I worried I might be flying a little close to the sun, talking about Veracruz, Spain, and beginning days of New World exploration, because these are all things that you're very familiar with. So I don't mind losing. I thought the odds might be a little long for me, but at least I got to share with you the story of the Count. And I'm so glad I got to share the story of the Count with everyone listening as well. If you want to get some extra content and some pictures from this episode, please check out our social medias. We're on Instagram at UnbelievablePod and Twitter at UnbelievablePC. Tell some friends and family about this pod. Hey, you're at Christmas, you don't want to deal with your family? Just put this podcast on. Just make people listen to us. I'm not saying that'll solve the solution, but they'll at least be mad about something else.
That's true. And I think this might be our last pod of 2024, Kurt. Any final words for the year?
I mean, it's a weird spot for us because it's the end of the year, but we're still like right on the climax of our season. So I feel like I can't take any relaxing to enjoy the holidays or starting fresh because I've got to be exactly the same amount of locked in, exactly the same amount of bloodthirsty the next time we record. So, I will say this. I think that both of us have told some really, really great stories this year. We've really been doing a lot to try to one-up each other, and I've been having a great time doing it. So I guess I'm just excited for it to continue.
That's right. Kurt's saying that he's going to be spending New Year's clenched.
I have a picture of Luis up on the wall that I'm throwing darts at on Christmas Eve.
And I am sleeping soundly because, as we all know, my mind goes blank whenever I'm not talking about this show. Whenever I'm not hitting record, I'm actually head empty, staring blankly at a wall until I have to reactivate to record.
When there's lack of stimuli.
That's true. That's true. I start photosynthesizing whenever we're not recording.
And so with that spirit, everyone, hope you have a great time. Thanks for listening. And remember, if somehow you get a chance, sell the Eiffel Tower. There is no downside. In fact, sell it twice if you can. Bye, y'all.
See ya.